Over the years, Family Solutions has recognized that one of the most significant components to successfully passing the AMFT RB exam relates to how well one is able to organize the vast wealth of knowledge and information that is required of you by the regulatory board. Those of you using our study guide realize how cogently it is written. Often we are asked how in the world do we keep track of all that we're supposed to remember, let alone keep it straight. In this module and in the next module, number 3, various meta-frameworks will be developed to hold this information. One such framework we have found to be most helpful is what I like to call Family Solutions' genogram of the family therapy world. This is, in a sense, a working genogram of the field of marriage and family therapy, starting with the major influences of Freud, then von Bertalanffy, and then Bateson, and tracking them across time, philosophical influences, ideology, and associations. We then frame the key 17 models of family therapy, looking at who developed them and the various connections between models that came before them. This module then becomes a means to locate a particular concept from one model and juxtapose it against a concept from another. We hope you find Family Solutions' genogram of the family therapy world and the subsequent discussion around the metaframe helpful. Let's join the workshop.
Let me shift our focus for the moment, and let's speak about things, frameworks that allow us to organize where our thinkings, where our systemic thinking has really sort of been influenced, or how it's been influenced. And one of the things I like to do is go back to the notion of periods, sort of cultural periods. And if we think of the cultural periods that are sort of in, the last 500 or so, 600, 700 years, we go back to the Dark Ages, the Age of Enlightenment or Reason, the Romantic period, the Modern period, the Postmodern period. Okay, what period are we in now? In modern. I don't think we're in postmodern, but we're also in the modern period. We still use science a whole lot. All right, so but we have these 4 periods, or 5, and if you can imagine that cultural periods tend to react to the preceding period, much like moving from one generation of a family to another. What do I mean by that? Has anyone had the experience in your families growing up where, in some way, manner, shape, or form, your grandparents and you had an understanding that perhaps your parents and you could not have? Anyone ever notice that? That somehow, such that what ends up happening, if you will, is that sometimes we, in our adolescence, what's adolescence about? What's the identity issue? It's about defining who we are, right? And how do we define ourselves in relation to our parents in adolescence? We are not our parents. We are everything that our parents are not. Hence, if our parents are ultra-conservative and we want to, sort of have that sort of differentiation from a psychodynamic point, not from a Bowen's point of view, if we want to separate from our family of origin, we become more not like our parents, and we might be a little bit more open or liberal in our thinking than ultra-conservative. If we come from very liberal parents, we might be very conservative in how we approach things. So there's sort of a normal reactionary process around identity that each of us goes through as an adolescent in relation to the family we've grown up in. Because what does that allow us to do? It allows us to help separate from our family of origin, because from adolescence, what's the next task? To leave home, to launch into the world. And if we're too enmeshed or caught up in their way of seeing the world, it's a little harder, perhaps, to separate. Okay? So, if we can imagine that there's that reactionary, there's the not them stance that goes on in cultural periods, if we start in the Dark Ages, the Age of Enlightenment ends up being what? A reactionary stance to the Dark Ages. The Romantic stage period then is a reactionary stage to the Age of Reason. The Modern period is a reactionary stage to the Romantic period, and the Postmodern, a reactionary stage to the Modern stage. Okay? So we have these philosophical or frameworks that are really sort of orienting the way thinking is occurring in the larger world and society. And this is on very, very global levels. So the Dark Ages were about what? What was life in the 12th century like? We had Attila the Hun. We had hordes of people going around maiming, pillaging, destroying, taking over, eating. It was almost cannibalistic. And how did we explain reality? In mystical terms. And what, if someone had an illness, what was going on? They were possessed by demons, witches, right? And how do we cure witches? We burn them at the stake, right? And if they didn't burn, they weren't a witch. Right? So it's like that old maxim in Puritan times in my part of the world, in Massachusetts, that if someone's a witch, what do? You throw them in the water. If they drown, they weren't a witch. If they float, they're a witch. Okay? When was that? That's only a couple hundred years ago. 250 years ago. Okay? So, or actually it was more than that. It was like 300 years ago. But the point is that, so we have religion then sort of emerging through this, because what's a religion doing? In a sense, it's taking and it's organizing on some level some of that mysticism and trying to create some safety. So the Age of Reason then comes in reaction to this mystical period, and the Age of Reason is really sort of trying to now say, well, now wait a minute. It doesn't seem to me if we, drill a hole in that person's head that the demons are going to necessarily escape. That maybe that's not the best explanation for this. Let's try to figure out, and in the Age of Reason we have, all of a sudden trying to sort of map the human body and trying to really understand the human psyche. Class emerges. Okay, so money emerges. So land, and we start having stratification between people. And so that rationality, sort of being able to think things through, becomes sort of the mode by which we are starting to organize the world. And people that were too rational, what happened? People that were too rational, Galileo, good example. What happened to Galileo? He was brought before the more mystical components of the Catholic Church back then, right? And really challenged in terms of that can't be true. It does not fit the way we understand things. Okay? And obviously, those struggles, those forces still are in play today in our society. Right? Darwinism versus creationism. Right? So we have lots of different frameworks still at battle from going way back to the 12th century. So we attempt in this Enlightenment to use reason or a rational way of looking at things to demonstrate the existence of a supreme being, and mathematics becomes sort of a way to start explaining natural phenomena. Very interesting. We react to that, though, and you say, wait a minute. That's not what's really going on. We're going to take this Romantic period. And Romantic period is not about cheesy romance films and everyone's going off hand in hand. What's the Romantic period about? It believes that we get as close to God as we can by virtue of getting as close to nature. And so the works of art, the music being composed, are all doing what? Emulating nature. So if you look at a period painting, Romantic period painting, you're going to have a flower depicted as close to real as possible. It's going to look exactly like, because that's how we get as close to understanding the essence of God. Okay? So truth comes from beauty. Closer one gets to nature, the closer one gets towards God. But we're looking at sort of the importance of nature and being one with nature in, sort of our lives as a means to meaning. But what we're trying to do is in these cultural periods, we're seeing sort of a trend towards understanding the meaning of things, the meaning of life, and sort of how one makes sense of our existence or reality. In reaction to that, comes then the modern period. And can someone tell me when the modern period begins, roughly? We're still not in the 20th century yet. We're in the 19th century, right? So the 1850s. Okay, just around the time of the Civil War. Okay? Now, around this time, how is mental health looked at? It's when they built all these great, huge psychiatric hospitals around the 1850s, 1870s, after the Civil War. Any of you ever work in one of those hospitals, like the Menninger Clinic, or I used to work at Butler Hospital in Providence, McLean Hospital, in Massachusetts. A lot of the buildings at NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health. Okay, and these were huge psychiatric hospitals, and what they had, all the sort of the units on top for all the patients, and then what was underneath the units on top? The catacombs. The 1870s and all the way up through the 1930s, we had the catacombs. And the modern period is really saying, okay, now we have to now shift our orientation to try to figure out how things really work. And Civil War, what were one of the sort of advancements in the Civil War that, in a sense, led the North to become more powerful? The invention of like the Gatling gun, right? Which machines, organization. And so after the Civil War, what happens? We have factories emerging. We start reducing manufacturing to component parts. We have production, line production, assembly lines. We're reducing things. So with the modern period comes in the ushering of reductionism. Okay, von Bertalanffy wrote a great book called Men, Robots, and Minds. Talked about the reducing of systems, ecosystems, to small parts. Okay, so the reducing of things is applying mathematics to try to understand how things work. It's reducing our blood chemistry down to white cells, red cells, blood cells, in order to try to find out sort of our health. We're looking at enzymes. And obviously, we would not be the society we are today had not this huge impetus start emerging in terms of finding out about science and developing science. Now, the modern period is, at the same time, mental health is still drilling holes in heads. It's walking. Did you ever see the movie Three Women by Robert Altman? Great flick. Shelley Duvall, Sissy Spacek. Opening scene in the movie. They're in one of these larger psych hospitals, and they have all these hospitals had huge wading pools about up to your waist. And when someone was catatonic, they would take the catatonic person with AIDS and they would walk them through the water. And that's the opening scene in this film. And that was one of the state-of-the-arts for dealing with catatonia. Another thing they'd work on with schizophrenia was to do what? Wrap them in sheets, cold water sheets, and have them go into hypothermia and shivering so much in hopes that somehow it would cure the schizophrenia or the psychotic delusions. Okay? They were still doing brain surgery and letting blood and things like that back in the 1800s, late 1800s. And from that point, who emerges? Our friend Sigmund. Okay? And Sigmund, probably the best theorist ever, I would guess, in terms of writing a solid theory, in terms of, that really spoke to all the different contingencies, around, for example, hysteria and everything. Very well thought out, very, sort of solid, except, of course, as we find out, a lot of it was wrong. But nonetheless, a lot of it was groundbreaking, the ego, the id, the super helpful information. But he really took this notion of reductionism and took it to the human psyche in terms of reducing things, which was groundbreaking versus just reducing, sort of still dealing with sort of the demonic possessions that mental health was attributed to up until the late 1800s. Now, let's put that in perspective. I'm 54, all right? Take two of me, right? That puts us about turn of the century, which is Freud's time. So two of me ago, this was the state of the art of mental health. Okay? To me, it's a very important perspective in terms of how much has happened in the last 100 years, let alone the last 50 years. So we have this modern period, and we believe that if somehow we reduce things to their smallest level, okay, what's the smallest particle we have these days? Yeah, quark. I got lost at the quark. There's a quantum. Okay, we'll go with the quantum. All right, but if we can get as close to it as possible, we can do what? We can actually understand the meaning of life. and the Human Genome Project. We can now clone life. Okay? If we break things down to the smallest levels, what ends up happening is we can emulate life, okay, and get the meaning of life. And so the modern period believes that if we reduce things, we will get the essence of it. Now, anyone that's ever truly studied mathematics knows that mathematics is what? An approximation of natural law. It is never natural law. Now, I flew down from Boston, and I was pretty comfortable with the approximation. That they had sort of planned out for JetBlue as I was coming in. But the reality is it is an approximation, and we have a certain faith to it. But is it actually natural law? It is not. Not at all. But we're comfortable with it. The problem that exists, though, in the modern period sometimes is that we have a certain expert knowledge. You know, when I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation today that I'm kind of making this all up, I'm constructing. I'm trying to use my knowledge base, but is it really the truth? It's not the truth, but it's the best I can come up with. And you guys are comfortable enough to come here and listen to me with my approximation of truth, much the same. What ends up happening is, though, we have a reaction to that, and the reaction is the postmodern period, which is where we're sort of on the cusp right now. And the postmodern period really speaks to the idea that we distrust any claims about truth. I don't know about you, but anytime someone tells me they have the answer to either their life or my life, I am terribly distrustful because I don't know that anyone has the truth, because I certainly don't. Even if I have to have brain surgery, the reality is that the surgeon that's opened my skull up and is sticking his probes in, I don't know if you probably haven't noticed, hopefully, but the point is they keep patients in brain surgery awake. Why? Because they want to know what happens when you stick the probe here. Can you still talk? They're approximating it. They're giving you their best guess based on the knowledge they have, but they do not have the answers. Okay? So what we're doing in the postmodern period is we're really recognizing that reality is constructed. And so this whole social constructivism starts emerging, where we acknowledge that we are constructing reality. Okay? That just because this is I would call this a water bottle, does not mean that it existed in another reality as a water bottle. I call it this. We have a shared language base so that we understand it as such, but it is not necessarily a given. So we become more and more comfortable with not knowing in the postmodern period, which is really the essence of the collaborative language piece. Okay? The collaborative language model is probably the epitome of the model that really is most comfortable with not knowing and utilizes that not knowing as a co-exploration. So, philosophically then, what are the influences? That was in terms of periods. We have two predominant ways of organizing then our philosophical thought. Any guesses? They both were sort of around the 1600s. John Locke and Immanuel Kant. Okay? Kant and Locke.
Inductive and deductive.
Yes. Okay? So we have a Lockean way and a Kantian way. So John Locke is actually, he says, truth, or ultimate truth, can be discovered through senses. The idea that your sense is actually your ability to perceive, that then collects enough information for you to discover truth. So truth exists. In other words, we have discovered this water bottle, that it existed somewhere in reality, and we have just sort of uncovered its purpose, okay, and its name, but it existed. Whereas Kant, on the other hand, and this is, remember, Locke is the basis for reductionism and is looking for empirical truths, which means reducing things to proof, almost mathematically. Okay? Whereas Kant says there are no great conforming principles that lie beyond nature, and really that reality is being constructed and emanates from the aesthetics or our perception and what we project in terms of meaning onto the reality we're confronted with. So Locke says we discover reality. Kant says we construct it. Okay? So that then, as we start thinking about our models, we're going to have models that are more Kantian, or constructivists, sort of believing that we're co-creating a sense of reality or meaning. Others are looking for things that exist, which are more modern. And all our family therapy models have elements of both. Okay? So modernism begins around 1850, right around the Civil War. And again, it comes out of that notion of the flight to the cities. Okay? There was a big flight from the farms to the cities. All right, let me catch this up. So, now I'm going to make a shift here to what I call the map of the world and the map of the family therapy world. And so we're now going to we have these overarching frameworks, more meta stances to help us organize ways of thinking, how models fit together, or what sort of overarching umbrellas they fit under. But now we're going to look at these modern theories. Okay? And so the beginning of our modern theory starts with Freud back in the 1890s. Okay? Now, what are the other sort of predominant sort of theories that our family therapy, our systemic models emanate from? We have Freud on one hand. What are the other ones? They would come again out from Freud, more psychoanalytically based. Von Bertalanffy, general systems theory, which is the 1920s. Okay, and what's another at this level? This is sort of like the highest level of thinking in terms of these models and where they begin. So if we have Freud, we have von Bertalanffy, and then we have Bateson. Right, cybernetics. Okay, now these are the three sort of roots to which our current models all emanate from. Okay? And has anyone noticed that cybernetics and general systems theory have a lot of similarity? How come? Anyone ever figured that out? And it has to do with shopping. It has to do with shopping. Department store shopping, in fact. Well, think of a big department store. What's one of the bigger New York department stores? Macy's. Good name, Macy's. There were conferences called the famous Macy's conferences. Anyone ever hear of the Macy's conferences? They were conferences where all the smartest, most interesting thinkers of the world were brought together by the Macy family, and it is the Storer family, were brought together to cross-fertilize for about a month, once a year. They would all go hang out in New York and have dinners and conversations and present papers, and they would hook up and really share ideas. There's something similar happening. It's called Conference of Ideas, happening in Boston, I think in just a few weeks, similar to this. Really interesting, where they bring people from across all disciplines together to really cross-fertilize, to sort of recognize that there are so many commonalities. And don't we find that when we study these models? That, models have the same concept in mind, but they're talking about it with different words, often. So, we have Bateson and von Bertalanffy actually meeting at the Macy's conference in the 50s. And that's where Bateson got a lot of his sort of cybernetic notions of, related to communication and feedback loops. Feedback loops in both, right? Okay? That's why they're so similar. So, we have different roots. Okay? And if you look, all these theories on top here, cybernetics, MRI, Milan, Bowen, contextual, experiential, internal family systems, structural, network, psychoed, these are all modern theories based on the way we just understood Locke and Kant. Why? Because they are looking for things that they believe exist. Freud believed something like an it exists. Let's do a little exercise, okay? Give me something in MRI that MRI believes exists. Attempted solutions to the problem. They're looking for attempted solutions. They're looking for life cycle nodes as being the point at which problems emerge. They're looking for the vicious cycle. Milan systemic, what are they looking for? Isomorphs. Isomorphs. Okay? Bowen, what's he looking for? Differentiation. Okay, wrong model. Whack, whack. No, okay, you got to use jargon properly. So, differentiation. He's looking for triangles. He's looking for what I love to call the blob. Undifferentiated ego mass. Okay, but he's looking for something. Did anyone ever see or didn't see it, you had to listen to it, the Bill Cosby record, the chicken that ate in New York City, the chicken heart that ate in New York City? Anyway, that's the blob. It's kind of getting bigger and bigger. Only us older guys know this. Okay, internal family systems, what are they looking for? The exiles, they're looking for managers. What's Whitaker looking for? What do you mean? I don't have a model. Battle for structure, battle for initiative. What's Satir looking for? Hoping for? Leveling of communication. What's EFT looking for? Primary, secondary emotions. What's contextual looking for? Balance, phase, ledger, multidirectional posture. Right? They're actually not looking for that. They're presenting that one. But they're looking for issues that relate to fairness. Okay? Object relations is looking for interjects, good and bad interjects. Mnuchin's looking for
Organization.
subsystems. He could be looking for fusion? Am I going to correct me? Someone want to correct me? Yes, because that's Bowen. Enmeshment. Okay. What's network looking for? Retribalization, like pulling everybody together. Okay. Having a confrontation. What's psychoed going to look for? Looking for imbalances in power and using information to balance power imbalances with the medical field. What's behavioral cognitive looking for? The problem needs to be changed. The reinforces that, right? Okay. Okay, now, we shift down and then we have our postmodern theories, which are more socially constructivist models, social constructivist models. Solution focus tends to begin to change the way language shapes reality. Okay? Not looking, even though there are modern elements of solution focused, they're beginning to introduce a social constructivist element. Feminist is looking to socially reconstruct gender meanings and power balances. Narrative is looking to reconstruct dominant stories, restory, change reality. Collaborative language is really stepping back and is the most postmodern of all of these models, which is why I separated at the bottom, because collaborative language is really sort of co-constructing and really allowing sort of the conversation or the dialogue to determine what the reality is and what's being focused on. They don't know what they're going to talk about, and they're also part of the puzzle too. So again, this is just a way to organize these models that are looking for things versus models that are constructing the meaning of things. Okay? Okay. Can we use constructivism and constructionism interchangeably? No. Okay. So what's the difference? Constructivism is what? It's in a sense how we construct things within our own minds. Right? Our own personal constructions of meaning. So when I say the word mother, everybody jumps to either their mother or a mother that somehow has a personal meaning. Whereas social constructivism, on the other hand, does what? It focuses on sort of the interpersonal, into the relationships of construct, how society constructs meaning, okay, in our way of life. So social constructivism is much broader in its perspective, whereas constructivism is more personal. Constructivism is focused more on your individual shaping of reality by virtue of your use of language, history, and the meanings you are attaching to whatever it is you're focusing on. So you are constructing meaning through your own experience and thinking and purpose. It's personal, happens inside your head. Whereas social constructionism is more interpersonal and has more societal implications and relational implications that requires shared constructions in agreement. For instance, is language a social constructionism or a constructivist in its basis? Because why?
It's a shared, we all have.
Because as I speak, we have certain understandings and agreement around the language we are using, right? That we are all saying, okay, the words I'm using, they're close enough, my meanings are close enough to your meanings so that you nod your heads when we have some kind of an agreement, okay? Whereas when I say, okay, I want everyone to now think of beauty, something they find depicts beauty like nothing else. And now we go immediately in constructivism because it's a personal, and we don't share that. You know, I go to my place in Little Compton, Rhode Island, on the ocean, and just out on my sailboat and just looking, that's where I am. Okay, that's my beauty, and yours is going to be someplace else. Okay, that's constructivism. We're now going to talk about again sort of where all these models come from, how we organize them, which model begets which model. And as we go back to where it all begins, it begins with Freud and his development of the psychoanalytic model. So we then come down to sort of who is sort of the person. I'll ask two questions. Who is the first person to ever do family therapy? The correct answer for the test is Nathan Ackerman. The real answer is John Bell. Okay? But the correct answer for the test is Nathan Ackerman. Okay? And Nate Ackerman, what he did is he took all of Freud's psychoanalytic frameworks and he started also starting to apply them into the context of a family. So, again, we have Freud, we have von Bertalanffy, and Bateson. So we have Freud with the psychoanalytic, von Bertalanffy with general systems, and Bateson with cybernetics. So von Bertalanffy comes from where?
You mean what place?
Yeah, where did he come from? Well, actually Canada, Ottawa, and he developed this notion of general systems theory, and he wrote General Systems Theory. He wrote Men, Robots, and Minds. He was really looking at what? How all human systems and machine systems, and systems, mechanical systems, have certain underlying structures or levels of organization that maintain the system. Right? So in here we have AC running that's maintaining a certain temperature. That temperature is being sort of altered by our body temperatures. Negative feedback loops, right, come in and sort of do what? Bring it back to a homeostasis or a steady state by virtue of kicking on the switch that hits the blower. Right? Okay, so von Bertalanffy is looking at systems or ecosystems. The way I like to think about von Bertalanffy is to think of ecosystems. You know, von Bertalanffy is the reason that we can't build a power plant because of a little spotted frog, because the frog is part of an ecosystem that changes the balance of what would happen if we were to, you know, sort of change the environment. So we're looking at sort of things that really hold systems together, human systems, family systems together. Bateson, on the other hand, remember his work comes from the 1940s, late 40s and early 50s. Bateson, what do we know about Gregory Bateson? He was married to Margaret Mead. They lasted a year, but thank goodness they were married because they had a wonderful daughter, and her name is Mary Catherine Bateson, who, if you ever get a chance when this is all over and she comes through town, she's a postmodern thinker. She is brilliant and interesting. She wrote a great book, which you can't read until you're done taking the test and passed, but the book's called Peripheral Vision. Peripheral Vision. Wonderful, wonderful lecturer and very interesting woman. But Gregory Bateson, during the 40s, what was going on in the 40s in the world? World War II. And Bateson wanted to get into the war effort. And what did he do? He developed guidance mechanisms for torpedoes. Self-correcting guidance mechanisms for torpedoes, even though he was an anthropologist. Self-correcting. Sounds like cybernetics to me. And their cybernetics was born. Okay? This notion of how do systems correct themselves? How do they sort of maintain themselves? What's the Greek word for cybernetics? Anyone know? Chironetics, which is basically steersmanship. It means steersmanship. It's a Greek word, and the roots means steersmanship. So, as we said, Ackerman's the father of family therapy. So, while we're on fathers and mothers and things like that, if Ackerman's the father of family therapy, who's the mother of family therapy? There is no mother, but it should be Virginia Satir. Okay? And that's actually why she took off to South America for so many years, because she was fed up with the fact that the gender politics of family therapy, like the gender politics of the world in the 60s and 70s, and perhaps even still in this century, this new century we've crossed into, are not exactly up to snuff. So we have mother family therapy. Who's the father of communication theory? He's involved with Bateson's group, was the editor of Family Process for many a year. Don Jackson, father of communications theory. Okay? So, we have Freud then influencing initially and most profoundly the whole object relations family therapy. And we think of Dix, Fairbairn, and Framo as people that are some of the key players there. And object relations takes what in particular, just off the top of our heads? The notion of introjects, okay? Good and bad introjects out of Freud. From Ackerman, and remember that one of the ways to remember this line of thought is because it's psychoanalytic, what does that imply in terms of training? Medical training. Medical model, which is, again, reductionistic, but it's more medical training, so that most of these models that emanate from this line of thinking from Freud tend to be people that were trained psychoanalytically, and that will always give you a few cues. What's sort of the hallmark of any kind of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic or object relations approach? Well, there's a certain unconsciousness, but also there's a historic element. Okay, we go back to infancy. This has occurred from, early childhood experience or infant experience. So, Bowen in his work, right? Bowen goes back and he looks at previous generations, has a real historic element, and Naj does too. Naj in his contextual model certainly is historic. It's looking at sort of how destructive entitlement emerges across generations, looking at ledger sheets across generations. Okay. And then Whitaker, I'm throwing Whitaker here, even though he's experiential, because he was also trained as an MD, a gynecologist, but nonetheless, he was trained as an MD. And Whitaker is someone that also has a historic point. I once finagled in my training when I was in my mid-20s the ability to give Carl Whitaker a ride from the airport to a workshop that he was presenting at. And so I borrowed a friend's car because I didn't even have a car at the time. I think I did. I had an old construction van, and I decided to borrow a car. So I got a car, and I got my sign, Carl Whitaker, in the airport. And this crusty old guy comes up to me and goes, "Yeah?" I said, "Dr. Whitaker, I'm supposed to give you a ride back." He goes, "I'm Carl." And so we walked back to the car, and I said, "Carl, I want to be a great family therapist someday. I really do. It's my goal." And so he says to me, he goes, "Kid, you better work out your shit with your family then." And but that's Carl Whitaker, okay? It's that he was just that kind of a protagonist and just bumped right into you. But he's historic. Work it out with your family, okay? Bateson, we have Bateson, and where's MRI? Palo Alto. So this is also known as the Palo Alto School of Family Therapy, also known as, what's the acronym stand for? Mental Research Institute, okay? Also the brief model, okay? And fits under the umbrella heading is that, now this is not particularly a convention that you will find on the test, but it's one for organizing models and everything. So we have the strategic models. And notice that what I'm doing here is that the strategic model, that's actually an R, the strategic models as an umbrella encompasses the MRI model, Which other? Milan and Haley strategic, which for our convention I'm putting with a capital S because it's a proper noun for Haley, his model. Whereas the umbrella, these are the strategic models. And so when we think of the notion of strategic, always remember to go at least back to the strategics, but then to make distinctions between MRI, Milan, and Haley strategic. Now, on the actual test, I believe, it's the convention, you'll always see Haley strategic. They don't just do strategic because of this confusion. But for our purposes, it can be very, very helpful to utilize the fact that these strategic models all have certain kinds of elements in common that we'll get to as we develop these strategic models in each of those strategic models in more detail. So we have MRI, and how did MRI begin? Well, it actually began with Gregory Bateson, and Don Jackson wasn't there to begin with, but Haley was there, and Fish and Fry, Bill Fish, Bill Fry, John Weakland, Virginia Satir and Jay Haley were actually grad students in working with them. And they received a lot of funding from an IMH, and what was in vogue to be studied those days? Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, okay? So schizophrenia is being studied, and so on the West Coast, schizophrenia is being studied by Bateson and his group. Who's studying it on the East Coast? Bowen. Haley's, at this moment in time, he's still on the West Coast. He hasn't traveled across and written Uncommon Therapy yet. Okay? He will. And so these folks are studying all different aspects, like Haley's studying the dreams of psychotic clients, and they're looking at communication theory. So what's going on here is that they happen to have a free floor office space in the house in Palo Alto, and Don Jackson, a psychiatrist, needs some space. He rents space, and what happens is that Jackson and Bateson start talking, collaborating, and now Jackson's consulting with Bateson's group, which was not a clinical group, it was a research group. And so Jackson brings in the clinical elements to this group. Who else consults to the MRI group? Erickson, Milton Erickson, who is known as, back to our fathers, the father of hypnotherapy. Father of hypnotherapy. Is he a therapist? No, he's a hypnotherapist. Okay? Therapist and hypnotherapist are not one and the same. Interestingly, just a quick aside, the studying of Milton Erickson, and this is a good question. Which model studied, I'm going to have a multiple part question here, which model studied one member of the MRI group along with Milton Erickson and created a whole new model of therapy, really emphasizing the way language or grammar, NLP, okay, that's part one of the question, correct, which is NLP is an acronym for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, okay? And who else did they study? So they studied Milton Erickson and Virginia Satir, okay? Virginia Satir and Milton Erickson, they took movies of them, because remember they didn't even have videotape in those days. They took movies of them, and they studied their use of language and wrote a number of interesting books. Anyone take a stab at any of them? Anyone have any on their shelves? The Structure of Magic 1, 2, and 3. And From Frogs to Princes. Transformation, okay. And this is about using language to do what? To induce trance. And from trance comes change, which is really trying to somehow emulate Milton Erickson's genius when it comes to dealing with trance and bringing people to a point where change can occur through indirect suggestion. So Milton Erickson's coming in here too, and so what does he offer? So we have the cybernetic elements, which stem from a connection between general systems. We have Don Jackson's focus on communication theory, and then we have Milton Erickson coming in with what? His ability to be strategic, to bypass resistance. Okay? So we have these converging elements that are bringing together what we now know as the MRI model, and it was a brief model too. Coming directly from general systems theory, on the other hand, is the structural model. And the structural model tends to be a model that is really emphasizing family organizational structure. We said earlier, we think of Haley, we think of hierarchy, we think of Minuchin, we think of subsystems is a nice quick way to get to it. Okay? So he's looking at how families are organized. So Bateson brings together the MRI group, and if we had to sum up the MRI's group sort of assessment of how they define the problem, the attempted solution is the problem. Okay? The attempted solution is the problem. And so we have someone in the solution focus group that happened to be studying, and a member of the MRI group. Who was that? Steve DeShazer. Steve DeShazer was part of the MRI group. Who's the head of the MRI group these days? It always sounds better if you pronounce the W like a V. Václavic. Okay? Not Watzlawick. Václavic. Okay? Václavic is and he was, again, in the second generation of thinkers at the MRI group, so under Satir and Fish and all those guys. But anyway, the attempted solution is the problem. And so there's an evolution. Steve DeShazer is trained in the MRI model, that the attempted solution is the problem, and he says, kind of like that, but how about if we look for exceptions to the problem? But there's a very nice progression there when you think about it. We go from attempted solutions to the problem to exceptions to the problem. Now, Milan systemic comes directly from the cybernetic element, not from the MRI so much, but from the cybernetic element. And when we think of cybernetics, we go back to Bateson's book, which? Great book. Hard to read, but a great book. Everyone should get it someday. Looks great on your shelf. Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And there was a pretty well-known chapter in there about alcoholism. And the treatise that he developed in that chapter on alcoholism was what? Had to do with... Now, this is a great example of what do you do on the test when you have no idea what I'm going to ask exactly, but I've given you enough information to get someplace. Okay? We have steps to an ecology of mind. Okay? We have a chapter on alcoholism, and we know somehow that influenced the Milan systemic group. Okay? So what do we think this concept is that I'm trying to get to? How do you get there? Give it a shot. Inaccurate, sloppy thinking is encouraged. Well, now myself, I'm going to start down Milan systemic. I think I'm going to get better coming in the back door than the front door here. So what do I think of when I think of Milan systemic? Milan systemic. Give me some names of Milan systemic people. No. Not quite. I see where you're coming from, and I'll give you a quarter credit for that. Okay? But Carl Tom is not. Okay. Chloe Madonis, I'm going to hook up the wire and put the buzzer on your seat for that one. No, not Chloe Madonis. Okay, Palazzoli. Okay, all right. Prata, Chikine, and Boscolo. Okay. Now we have at least the four theorists. Okay. What's their most famous article? If you know this, you can put together the model. 3 words. Hypothesizing. Thank you. What is it? Circularity and neutrality. Okay. Now we have a way to find ourselves back to Bateson in this chapter on alcoholism. Do you think he wrote about neutrality when it relates to alcoholism? Okay. Hypothesizing when it relates to alcoholism. Circularity is an interesting word here. So circularity speaks to what? What are we talking about circularity? Circular causality, right? Recursiveness. Okay, circularity. So Bateson's premise in this article was really to speak to the notion of circularity, or in this chapter in this book. And that very much interested the Milan systemic group. Now, we talk about circularity in Milan systemic. And now, for those of you taking this test in the next few weeks, we're going to have to get you thinking quickly and laterally. These connections are, we're going to have to, what is it, green tea that helps synapses fire faster? All right, I want lots of green tea at lunch. Okay? Everyone order, have a sip right now and I'm going to ask you. But the point of the matter is that we need to be able to sort of quickly go to from circularity, okay? And so how does that then sort of become interesting to the Milan group? Where do they take that notion in their model? It's the use of circular questions, which is where your 25% correct comes from with Carl Tom, because he took that notion of circularity, developed the technique of circular questions around the same time that the Milan Systemic Group did their dog and pony show all over the country, which was fun, by the way, for those of us that went to those conferences. But the point is, circularity had to do with what more? The hypothesizing to generate the what? Positive connotation. The positive connotation. Okay? So circularity to the positive connotation, and I'm going to say this 1,000 times over the next few days, but I'm going to start it now. Is a positive connotation the same as a reframe? A positive reframe. Does positive connotation occur in any other model besides Milan systemic? Do any other models use positive connotation? Oh. That would be a no. Okay? That would be a no. Make sure you only think of positive connotation when it comes to Milan systemic. That's the only time ever. Okay? The reality of this is that we have to make sure that we only think of the positive connotation as the reframing the what? The circularity of every family member's position, role in maintaining the symptom, the presenting symptom.
Oh, I get it.
Okay? That's what a positive connotation is. But note again, it comes from Bateson's notion of circularity. Okay? Now, so we have Milan systemic. And coming off as well, we have Virginia Satir. Because she's branching off, and she's... What years does she kind of break away? 60s. All right. Now, Melanie, how long did you live in California? 7 years. No. Anyone in California in the 60s? Any of us old enough to know what was going on in California in the 60s? Wish we were in California in the 60s. Okay. There were things like tea groups going on in California, and tea groups were a very open sort of just experimental way of change, and people were having sort of a lot of sort of group experiences with sort of being honest and genuine and real and open to each other. Okay, so the T groups are happening, and Virginia Satir kind of goes off in that whole TA transactional analysis emerged at that time. Good parent, bad parent stuff, and all that kind of. If I have a good parent in me and a bad parent in me. So she goes off and she moves and she takes from the Milan systemic, from the MRI model, she takes the sort of experiential, the affective element, the command element. Does everybody remember that every communication must have two elements? It has to have a report and a command. Okay? So I'll get that off in a sec. Every communication has to have a report and command. So I'm communicating to you right now, correct? And I'm communicating to you, and the words I'm saying is what? That's the report element. It's the content element. What's the command element?
Pay attention is one element of it. You have to listen to me.
It's the
Oh.
power, it's sort of the, it's about what the message really means.
It has something to do with the relationship between the sender and the receiver.
Power differential.
The sender and the receiver, okay? And so because I've got the clicker, right, at the moment, that's why, men don't like giving up clickers. They're trying to make a statement about the relationship. Or what's the clicker? Anyway, the point is, there's something about that relationship. Virginia Satir sort of veered off, and the way she veered off is that she wanted to pay attention a bit to that command element, that relational element, and she did it through affect and communication. Okay, so that what ends up happening is Virginia Satir is actually moving the whole sort of MRI model and taking that emotional or affective component and shifting it to her realm of emphasis. So if we make a shift then, that thus far we have models that are really modern models above this line of the postmodern social constructivist shift. Okay, these are models that are really, as they emanate from Bateson, they're really focusing on sort of what, sort of, they're looking for things that they want to change. Satir's looking at communication she wants to change. MRI's looking at sort of the vicious cycle. Milan's looking for, sort of what's maintaining the symptom in terms of the circularity of it. A shift occurs, and we sort of move with DeShazer's work and Berg's work to looking at sort of how reality becomes a bit more constructed. From this model, we also sort of then move down to the narrative model, which takes, if we go from attempted solution, exceptions to the solution, how does the narrative sort of build on that?
Can you go back just a bit to the solution focus, that
Yes.
the shift across the line?
The shift is that language all of a sudden becomes reality, meaning that Steve DeShazer was fond of saying that if you, as a client, go to see 5 therapists, and I truly believe this is true, you walk away with 5 different problems. Right? Choose your therapist wisely. So he's really noting that it's the language and the way we talk about things that generates problems, not necessarily that problems pre-exist. And that's that real shift from modern to constructivist thinking. Okay? And so from there we move to the narrative model, and again we go, just to repeat myself, we go from attempted solutions to exceptions to solutions to externalizing problems. Okay? So he's taking it now to a step, and who's he? Narrative and David Epson. Okay, so we have Epson and Michael White. Michael White just died, unfortunately. Huge shock to the world. And he's taking it to sort of our attempting to sort of identify a problem and externalizing it such that we are now, and through using circular questions and the like, we're now moving outside of that problem so that people get caught in Michael White's model in this notion of what? A subjugated problem, a problem that holds one down. One's held prisoner to a problem or a story. He's looking for people to escape from that story they tell about themselves, right? And create a new dominant, to re-story or to create a new dominant story, okay? A new dominant story being that I'm going to pass this test and I really am going to have great facility. Yes, I'm looking at you. I'm going to have great facility when it comes to being able to talk across models, okay? So reality, again, note we're well on the side of constructionism, is because reality is that we are now able to generate our own story about what our possibilities are. Very important shift. But again, it's coming right down this line. Okay? And, again, I had mentioned Carl Tom was very interested in the notion of circular questioning. When you think of circular questioning, you think Milan, but particularly you think of Carl Tom. That's with a K, T-O-M-M. And he also influenced the narrative model as well. Tom, yep. And then from the narrative model, just again following this line, we come across to the collaborative language notion, which is that we are moving from, again, a very expert stance up here to a construction of reality, but all of a sudden, we as therapists, and this is why, frankly, I'm a strong advocate of collaborative languages, that as therapists, we can now enter into the room as well, and we can utilize what's going on in our lives. We're not just blank slates. Collaborative languages is as far as on the continuum from Freud as you can be, because Freud's just sitting behind the person, and occasionally he grunts, whereas what collaborative language is talking about who you are as a person. He's saying, I'm reminded of, oftentimes I'll tell a story about, I was talking with someone last night, and we were talking about my daughter's having trouble sleeping last 3 nights. She's getting in her head, can't sleep. I'm worried about sleeping. She's not sleeping. And Dean reminded me, oh, that's like that story you told me when she couldn't sleep before because she thought she was going to die. And I changed the story with her. I said, and I used a strategic technique, but I also changed her story. I said, I don't know if you know this, but I know CPR really well. And I think we should practice just to see if you are going to die. I want you to try to stop breathing. She thought she was going to stop breathing while she was sleeping. I said, I want you to stop breathing right now. If you die, I'm going to bring you right back because I'm really good at it. But see if you can stop sleeping. I stopped sleeping, stop breathing. And so she tried, and obviously she couldn't stop breathing. And it kind of defeated the whole point of her worrying. Now she can't even do it on purpose. How's she going to do it when she's not paying attention? And so she was able to let that go. But it's a good example of how you change the story with someone in terms of how they're thinking about things. And that subjugated story becomes sort of the way in which we hold ourselves down. And when you go to a party, right? You go to a party. What's the question that everybody asks you the first time you meet them for the very first time? Hey, what do you do? So what do you do? And what do you have at that moment? It's a golden opportunity. You can change the story. Now, all right. Now we got camera guys here too, so we have to be a little careful what we say now. What's one of the things we never do on an airplane? When someone says to you, "What do you do?" You never say you're a therapist. You lie. You say something else. You pick a part of yourself that is so obscure that they would not even want to talk about it. Okay? Those of us, ever been caught on a plane with somebody that tells you their sex life like you don't want to believe? You're not a therapist on an airplane. I give you permission to be whatever you want to be. Okay? Play with that story. But it's restoring. But that's what the narrative model is really doing. It's giving people an opportunity to change a story. There's a great, speaking of stories, Michael White would tell a story of this woman came into his office for an interview. And Michael White, like me, has a lot of piles in his office. My office is not the neatest office in the world. I'll confess it, I guess, to everyone now. And so Michael White this woman came in, and she was psychotic and not making any sense. And Michael White said, I know we're supposed to do a session here, but I have a favor to ask before we start the session. As you can see, my office is a kind of a disaster area here, kind of a mess. And you happen to be, obviously, an expert at dealing with chaos and things that are just disorganized all over the place, listening to the way you're talking right now. Could you do me a favor before we start the session? Just give me some advice on what I should do to organize my office a little bit better. She snaps out of her delusional talking and says, obviously you have no filing system. And if you do, you're not using it. What's that about? So it was just this, he created what he would call a what? Unique outcome, okay, or a sparkly moment. He generated by tapping into what? Her expertise, restoring it, renaming it in a way such that what was once her subjugated story now gets bumped into what? Dominant story status, and she's now able to become an expert. And she, why talk crazy if someone sees that your craziness is an expertise? And let's put it to work. Brilliant. It was on tape. It was phenomenal. And for the rest of the session, she made perfect sense. Just shifted from talking psychotically. So we have these, we have these opportunities with, again, this constructing of reality or the restoring or reconstructing reality in these latter models, including the feminist model. And let's sort of bring that in. Now, feminist family therapy model is not feminism. They're not the same. Okay? Feminism was a movement that really dealt with a lot of the same issues, but it's not feminist family therapy. Okay? What's feminist family therapy? And
You acknowledge that through time that there has been a power differential with men and women.
okay.
So then you compensate, you create an awareness around that, and you make changes in the family that accommodate that, right?
Yes. Now, so to reiterate that, you look at the fact that in society there have been huge imbalances around the issue of power between men and women. Okay? And so what you do in your therapy, in feminist family therapy, is that you imbalance it in the opposite direction. In society still, men have more power than women. And so what you do as a feminist family therapist, and it's not just women that are feminist family therapists, I happen to be a feminist family therapist, what we do is we imbalance power to sort of have it lie more with women than with men in hopes, and this is a social constructivist model, because why? Because we're hoping to ripple that out into society because both men and women are subjugated or held down by gender biases or biases and gender roles. That little boys can't be emotional is as much a problem as that women are not allowed to take on similar levels of or higher levels of responsibility that men can take on. It's all very related. Okay? So the feminist family therapy model is socially reconstructing, constructing a new reality that goes beyond the way society has evolved. Okay? So if we then sort of get this map of the world a little bit more complicated, but nonetheless it begins to make even more sense. So we have this line of thought coming down with MRI to Milan systemic to solution focused. Narrative begets feminist, also collaborative language. J. Haley, we didn't talk about that directly, but J. Haley is a straight offshoot of the MRI model. So when you think of J. Haley, think of MRI, okay, which means that the emphasis, the attempted solution, is a bit of the problem, okay? And so that we're looking at, what's the MRI sort of term for the attempted solution? Vicious cycle. Vicious cycle. So the vicious cycle, which is sort of the stuck structure or disabling sequence, as I would call it, that pattern is what you're sort of coming up with, being presented with. That's what keeps the symptom, or where the symptom emerges. And so with J. Haley, what he does is he also borrows from, obviously, Milton Erickson. He wrote a great book on Milton Erickson called Uncommon Therapy, which is a great read, almost reads like a novel, talking about sort of Milton Erickson's ability to work through hypnosis with people. But he had a special relationship with who? J. Haley. In fact, someone, who? Oh, yes, he married her. It was a very special relationship. And it is a special relationship. And he also divorced her. But so yes, with Madonnas. But in terms of his model in particular, he had a very special relationship with Mnuchin when they were co-directors of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic. And if you go up to our website and you look in the forums, I put up Mnuchin's eulogy of J. Haley. It's very nice. It's very nice. And it's worth reading because Mnuchin, Haley, and Bravo Montalvo carpooled from D.C. or places to Philadelphia every week when Haley and Mnuchin shared the directorship, the clinical directorship of Philadelphia Child Guidance. Now, can you imagine what those car rides were going to be like, or would be like? Unbelievable. We have J. Haley, who's about power and hierarchy. We have the Argentine Papi in Sal Mnuchin. Bravo was in the back seat, I guarantee you, all the time. And who would drive? I don't know. You ever hung out with Sal Mnuchin? So the point being is, what I'm starting to do now, if you can sort of pull back to the meta level, I'm trying to develop some caricatures I'm being absolutely unfair to every one of these people I'm talking about. But I'm talking about them in ways that begin to help you sort of understand aspects of their personality so you can better hold their model in your head. And that's one of the things you want to do. Okay? So that we have the structural element of what coming into Haley's strategic model? Hierarchy, which he borrowed from Minuchin. And he cross-fertilized Minuchin's work with what? The notion of strategic techniques. Paradox, prescribing the symptom, reframing, okay? So that's why structural has indirect strategic paradoxical techniques, and that's why Haley has the use of hierarchy, or the element of hierarchy is something he's assessing and something he's realigning. The question is whether or not we see an awful lot of structural strategic, J. Haley strategic comparisons on the actual test, and the reason for it. The reason is that the two are hard to tease apart in some ways, and they are very fundamental models that the whole field has been built upon. There was a time where there was a model called the structural strategic model. Okay, and some of us were trained in the structural strategic model. It's no longer in place, but it came and really emanated from the period of time when Haley and Minuchin were carpooling. Okay, and it really emanated, again, from the merging of aspects of their model. But remember, Haley only talks about hierarchy, in terms of the organizational structure, whereas Minuchin talks about all of it. And Haley's emphasis is on problem solving. Both look, though, however, at sort of family life cycle nodes, as does MRI. Family life cycle nodes being moments at which a family has to reorganize itself, and when a family attempts to go from one stage of development to the next, it has to, in a sense, that's why we say when a kid moves to the next stage, he regresses, right? A family has to, in a sense, deconstruct, it's a euphemism for regression, has to deconstruct in order to reorganize itself in a very particular way.
So structural and strategic really look at those nodes, those transition points. Is there another one?
Well, ask the question. So let's ask the question and see if you can all answer it. Who else looks at family life cycle development nodes as being significant in terms of where problems emerge in families? I would say Bowen doesn't. Milan, MRI, strategic Haley, and structural Minuchin. Okay? Yes. That again, but again, note it's kind of easy to see sort of again that line and how it works that way. I talked a little bit about this psychoanalytic line. If we follow it down over here, what we see, we also have emotionally focused couples therapy. Okay, that is under our experiential model, right? Because what it's looking for is this model is really focusing on how couples attach, which is the psychodynamic element of it. Bowlby's work around attachment. Can anyone sort of give me a nutshell version of what that means? Bowlby's attachment theory.
Well, that you have to have a secure attachment to a caregiver, particularly your mother, to have a sense of being loved and lovable and, well, now I'm getting into some other things, but to really have a secure bond, and that when you don't, and feel safe and you don't, then that stuff sort of replays itself in other relationships through life.
Okay, so what you've just said is that it's essential for infants and children to learn at a very early age that attachment and a really solid, trusting attachment to caregivers. I'm going to expand beyond a mother. It's really caregivers or adults. That when you have a safe, secure attachment, you have a trusting view of the world. And hence that trusting view of the world allows you to have trusting relationships. If you believe that good things will happen when you get close in intimate relationships, if you weren't abused, if you weren't lied to, if you weren't abandoned or rejected, and you believe the world's a safe place, you then come to a partner expecting that kind of relationship. That's the norm. If you have the antithesis of that, and you expect life not to be safe, people not to be trusted, if you were abused or rejected or love was withheld or was conditional, you then look to partners that understand that model, according to Bowlby, and you then sort of replicate the potential to have unfulfilled, unsafe relationships related to attachment. When attachment needs, and this is, I guess, the most important point about Bowlby, is that when attachment needs are not met, when you do not have secure attachment, what happens? You revert to primitive strategies in order to try to bring it back. The EFT model says that primary emotions, which come from that secure attachment or that place of feeling that we need to be attached, we need to have intimacy, we need to be able to trust people, we need connection. Okay? If that's occurring, then we don't need to have secondary expressions of that or secondary emotions because we can relate and connect with people directly. If it's not happening, we go to the primitive, more sort of secondary emotional level, which does what? It then gets into a sort of a aggressive, almost extreme, fear-based response towards trying to get the primary emotions back in place. So that this EFT model takes the premise that the reason people get caught in that secondary emotional reactive state is because they're trying to get back to a safer connection. They want attachment. But the problem is they are not able to express their primary emotional needs at a much deeper level because they don't believe it's safe to. Okay? So that's the Bowlby piece. The Carl Rogers piece of the emotionally focused couples therapy really focuses on what? The notion of unconditional positive regard. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach through the therapist relationship, because you're going to sort of generate a positive relationship in emotionally focused couples therapy, a positive connection between the therapist and the client, and then you're going to sort of give them an experience of what it means to get your needs met on that deeper emotional level, and then you bring in the other partner and teach them how to do it. But there are a whole series of notions that you have to go through, and we'll talk about it when we get into that model in more detail. Okay? All right. Have we missed anybody? Internal family systems, again, comes out of this notion of more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic. That's Dick Schwartz's model. It's somewhat new. It's kind of cool. It talks about multiple personalities that we all have inside our heads, so to speak, these multiple personalities. Anyone ever see that one-season show on TV called Inside Dave's Head? I liked it. Didn't last. But the point of the matter is, what ends up happening in this model is that we have different personalities inside of us, sort of like a family inside of us. So you do family therapy inside the individual's head. Okay, this is sort of the quick way to think about it. And what you do is that you have four people, in a sense. You have the exile, who's the childlike, more traumatized part of yourself that bad, traumatic stuff's happened to. You have managers, you have firefighters, and then you have the self. So we have these four parts inside of ourselves in the internal family systems, which gets back into notions of, like Jung and whatnot, of subpersonalities. Okay? So the job is that somehow the trauma or the pain that the exile feels, in a nutshell, is managed by the manager, keeps you really busy, never lets you think about the pain, always keeps you doing things. Okay? Anybody ever have something hard happen in their lives, and the expression or the advice someone gives, just get busy, stay buszy, keep working, just you'll get through it that way. That's a manager strategy. And then there's the other strategy: you get drunk, get high, use any kind of addictive behaviors you might have to numb out the pain. That's the firefighter strategy. And the firefighter and the manager don't believe that the self, okay, the self-led person, our real selves, has the capacity to protect and take care and nurture the exile. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what internal family systems is about, and you're going to see that on the test as well. Okay. Dick Schwartz. The family therapy concepts and methods. That Dick Schwartz book. That's the Dick Schwartz. But he's getting a lot of press these days about it. One quick tip: pay attention to Family Therapy News, now it's called Family Therapy Magazine. Family Therapy Magazine. Look at what they're writing about. Those tend to be the models that are oftentimes in vogue. So Emotionally Focused got written about recently, Internal Family Systems has, domestic violence. You look for those kinds of patterns and discussions, oftentimes.
So now you have a sense of how the field of marriage and family therapy evolved over the past 50 years. In the next section of your virtual workshop series, I will go into greater detail with each of the major schools of marriage and family therapy, helping you further fill out the models. Using a map of the world, we will locate each of the major schools of thought and conceptually begin filling each of these schools out a bit more. In addition, the next section will focus on general systems theory, cybernetics, and communication theory.